All right, I've got Dr. Tommy Wood. Doc, what did you have for breakfast?
I had a late breakfast today because I had a late dinner last night, so I wasn't really hungry till like the middle of the day. But I had a pound and a half of yogurt with a scoop of whey protein and a bunch of pineapple.
Nice. It's actually pretty similar to mine. Mine was just berries, so instead of the pineapple. Interesting. All right, so Dr. Tommy Wood, one of my favorite people in the world. I know him from some mutual people that I've worked with on the Department of Defense side. Tommy, can you give a quick introduction of who you are, just a 500-foot aerial view of what you're all about before we just jump right into this stuff?
Sure. So I am an assistant professor of pediatrics and neuroscience at the University of Washington. My day job, as I call it, is as a basic neuroscientist trying to find ways to treat the injured brain. And at multiple life stages. So early in life, I do a lot of work in neonatal brain injury, pediatric brain injury, then also later life traumatic brain injury, and then finally late life cognitive decline. And then I sort of have an applied side as well, where I work with particularly elite level athletes and various other groups who are at high risk of traumatic brain injury, and then some individuals who either have or are at risk of cognitive decline to try and sort of either mitigate or prevent neurodegeneration and changes in cognition as people get older. So the kind of the 30,000 foot view is I look at all the different ways that we can keep the brain healthy and functioning throughout the entire lifespan.
Yeah, man, you've got a pretty wide spectrum there, which is perfect. Just all the way down from neonatal all the way to elite athlete, and that's pretty awesome. All right, so I want to jump right in because it's the way YouTube is. We want to get right to the meat and potatoes, or in this case, I guess the steak and the eggs of it. But we want to talk about autophagy. Okay, now most of the people that are probably listening to or watching this, they know autophagy as something that happens when they're fasting, and they don't really think of it throughout the entire umbrella in which it occurs. And I've tried talking about it on my channel to a lot of different degrees, explaining that, look, at autophagy is in a lot of ways almost always occurring some degree, whether it's in our pinky toe or in our liver or whatever. One of the things we wanted to talk about is when you look at the world of autophagy, arguably the best way to induce autophagy is actually through exercise. Not saying that fasting doesn't induce autophagy, but can you explain this a little bit more? Because I found this very interesting. Check out today's video sponsor, Thrive Market. So if you're trying to change your life a little bit, you're trying to eat better, Thrive Market is an online membership-based grocery store that has tons of better for you options. And I don't just mean tons, like they have pretty much everything you could think of if you're trying to eat better. And that link down below will save you 25% off your entire grocery order. So your entire grocery order, plus you get a free gift when you use the special link that is down below this video. So you go into Thrive Market, you can sort by category, paleo, vegan, keto, whatever, autoimmune paleo, AIP, anything you want, and then you can subcategorize based on that, like, oh, I want sugar-free, or oh, I want baked goods, or oh, I want gluten-free. It makes shopping so easy and so intuitive, like with how our brain works for what we're looking for. And then it's delivered to your doorstep in a couple days, and trust me, you'll never want to go to the grocery store again. It makes life so easy, especially if you have a busy family. So that link is down below to save 25% off your entire grocery order.
So I'm going to steal a phrase from Bill Lagarkos, which is that exercise is fasting and fast forward, particularly when it comes to autophagy. And when you look at the data both in humans and then in rodents, and the reason why you might look at rodents is because if you're interested in autophagy outside of the muscle tissue, we might take humans, get them to exercise or fast, look at autophagy, do a muscle biopsy. That's not too bad. But if you want to look at the liver or the brain or some other tissue, right, difficult to do in humans, but much easier to do in animals. So we kind of have to look at a bit of both. But when you look at the applied literature in humans, 60-minute bout of low-level intensity aerobic exercise, like 50 to 60% of VO2 max, upregulates autophagy as much as a 72-hour fast. And they've even done studies where they have people fast for 36 hours before they do exercise, or they have them continuously fed during exercise. They give them a glucose infusion during exercise. And that fasting period before the exercise doesn't increase the autophagy response to exercise. It's all driven by the exercise itself. And if you give people a glucose infusion while they're exercising, that also doesn't blunt it. So it's really the exercise that's driving that autophagy response rather than the nutrient availability, either fasting or fed.
That's really interesting. So does nutrient availability outside of an exercise state still influence autophagy as we've sort of suspected over the last few years, though?
Yeah, absolutely. But you really have to think about the net energetics of the cell. So at rest, yes, nutrient availability does, of course, regulate autophagy, because we know that sort of the major initiator of autophagy, ULK1, is activated or inhibited by mTOR or AMPK. So it's all about nutrient sensing. So yes, if you're in the fed state and you're rested, then you will inhibit autophagy and you can upregulate it with fasting and upregulating AMPK. However, if you're doing exercise, the net energetics of the cell are, of course, you're creating an energy deficit or energy flux through the cell, and then that's much greater than the general energy availability. So then that net effect is an overall, in general, at least initially, activation of AMPK and activation of autophagy during exercise, regardless of the nutrient availability.
That makes a ton of sense. When it comes down to types of exercise, is there arguably a better type of exercise? I mean, aerobic exercise seems to be a big, powerful driver, but does it matter how much the body is moving? I mean, a body through space obviously moves a lot more than, say, just sitting on a bike ergometer or something. Are there specific kinds of exercise or resistance training or functional style training like CrossFit where you're kind of combining a lot of these? Is there any literature on that, or do we just have to take a guess? Or
yeah, it's a good question. Some people have looked at relative intensities of aerobic exercise, and in that setting, the more intense, the greater the upregulation of autophagy. And again, if we think about this as an energy sensing system, then that makes sense, right? The greater you tax your muscles from an energetic standpoint, the greater the activation of these processes. But that's comparing 55% of VO2 max to 70% of VO2 max. That doesn't answer your CrossFit or sprint training question. They've done studies where they had either people do sort of a steady state or add intermittent high intensity sprints on top of the steady state, and adding the steady state didn't further increase autophagy, but it also didn't decrease it. So it seems like a prolonged-ish period of something that looks relatively aerobic, but at the higher intensity end seems to be where you get the greatest activation of autophagy from an exercise standpoint. But I don't think anybody's really looked at, resistance training or sort of just interval sprints. However, we do know separately that if you do, say, exhaustive resistance training, like they have studies where you do 10 sets of 10 to failure of leg extension, something that sounds awful. And you can get significant upregulation of AMPK by doing that. And I think, we can infer that you would be getting upregulation of autophagy. They just haven't measured it in that kind of setting, as far as I know.
Interesting. I wonder if at a certain rate, glycogen depletion also plays a role with that. If someone is, especially when you're looking at that high volume kind of stuff, that sounds like German volume training to me, which is utterly miserable. Yeah. A colleague and I, Matt, we were talking about this before this, and if we look at that, okay, if autophagy is induced by exercise, then in theory, when you are moving a muscle for resistance training, and you have this localized activation, this mTOR C1, are you potentially, if mTOR inhibits autophagy, are you inhibiting mTOR inhibiting autophagy at a muscle level when you are resistance training, albeit autophagy may still be occurring within different organs and mitochondria within different organs? Interesting question, but I'm just curious on that, if there's any idea whatsoever.
Yeah, I think if we go back to that sort of similar scenario where you're doing very high intensity, exhaustive resistance training, as an example, you get an early activation of AMPK followed by a delayed activation of mTOR. So I think that you may get some autophagy as an early response. And one of the reasons we undergo autophagy is because in the cell, you're trying to access nutrients for energy metabolism. And this is one of the reasons why we respond to an injury where you get reduced energy production with autophagy, is because we're just we'll just start taking what we don't need because we need whatever we'll take whatever we can get from an energetic standpoint to use for energy metabolism. And so there's that early response. So I think you can still activate autophagy, and then you get a later growth and repair response. So I don't think they're necessarily antagonistic. They just happen differently in sort of timescales.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That's really interesting to think about. And you touched on this, and there were little hints of it that I want to make sure that it's kind of coming to light more in an explained way. With fasting for extended periods of time, say 24, 36, 48 hours, after those longer fasts, then exercise seems to become a fasting accelerator, but not necessarily prior to that. Is that what you were alluding to?
No, I think
the opposite?
The opposite. The exercise mimics fasting from an autophagy standpoint, at least, regardless of the context that you put it in. So if you do exercise after an extended fast, or you do exercise when fed, you get the same autophagy response. So
I think what I meant was, are you going to get additional benefit by fasting while exercising at that rate? And I think what you were saying before was something like the only time where exercise might add additional benefit with fasting is if it's a longer fast. So it's not necessarily, the fast length doesn't necessarily matter as far as how exercise is going to impact it.
Yeah, so I think there's two important things that come out of that. When you look at fasting, and I think the longest they've done is 36 hours fast, a 36-hour fast prior to exercise. So I don't think I can comment beyond that. But if you do 36 hours of fasting plus the exercise, that period of fasting doesn't give you a bigger autophagy response when you exercise. However, when we think about extended fasting in general, this is kind of separate but important. With longer fasts, you start to get this picture of what we call quote unquote physiologic insulin resistance, which I hate as a term. But what it means is you're sort of changing how you'll then respond to certain nutrients in order to sort of prioritize where nutrients are going in the body while you're fasting. If at the end of that fast you then have a massive blowout, you're then going to have much larger responses, say in blood sugar, to that meal than you would have done if you hadn't fasted for several days beforehand, just because of the way the body is sort of prioritizing nutrient handling during the fast. However, you can offset some of that by exercising during fasting. So this is now separate from specifically autophagy, and now we're just talking about in general sort of cell level insulin sensitivity in the muscle tissue. But
that makes sense.
Yeah, there's some benefit. I think there's benefit from moving or doing exercise during extended fasts, but it's not necessarily directly related to autophagy. It's related to maybe some other processes, particularly what then might happen when you break that fast.
Yeah, and we're going to do a separate topic specifically on that, and just the fact of and we'll kind of hint at it here just so you have an idea, but essentially movement during fasting is probably one of the most important things, and it's something that I've talked about a lot. If you don't use it, you lose it, and that's definitely when you're in this state where you're not having nutrients coming in. It just makes a lot more sense that you should be moving, but it's counterintuitive to what you might think initially, like, oh well, I move, I'm going to break down all my muscle, and it's quite the opposite. It's more about use it so your body doesn't see it's necessary to burn it. Yeah. Peter Attia had mentioned something a while back, a couple of years back, about muscle protein breakdown during a fast, potentially allowing for sort of a reallocation of amino acids into other areas of the body. So purely hypothetical and just like theoretical here, but you break down cells from your skin and they break down and they deaminate, and you also have amino acids that could stimulate muscle protein synthesis during a fast. So you kind of have this sort of regurgitation that's going on, if you want to call it that, or recycling in a weird way. And the evidence is a little bit kind of bleak. I know there's a Journal of Applied Physiology study that kind of looked at it a little bit, but do you know much about that? And based upon this, could we argue that maybe aerobic exercise, based upon this autophagy process we're talking about, could actually help stimulate muscle protein synthesis as well?
So, yeah, again, there are multiple potential pieces to this. During extended fasting, but also during, say, prolonged endurance bouts. So you're thinking about like ultra marathons, potentially, or longer endurance bouts. this redistribution of amino acids is important for something called anaplerosis, which is basically the replenishment of intermediates in the Krebs cycle so that you can keep using it to generate energy. Because as you use the Krebs cycle, these intermediates come off and maybe they go into different biosynthetic pathways and things like that, but you need to replenish it, and amino acids are the source of that. And if you're not consuming those in your food, then that needs to come from somewhere. So muscle tissue or other tissues that are undergoing some kind of proteolysis, that will provide, and that's a beneficial thing, that's important. So that's part of that redistribution. In terms of aerobic exercise stimulating muscle protein synthesis, I think it probably depends on the individual and again their training status, because if you're completely untrained, we know that aerobic exercise stimulates muscle tissue because it's just like it's a brand new stimulus, right? You haven't had that stimulus, and it's going to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, and you're going to build muscle like regardless of what that movement is or the level of intensity, really. Later on, if you're a well-trained individual, I'm not sure that that's the case. You'll get that same stimulus. However, it may help you to again redistribute. So there are these tissues that you no longer need. Maybe you've lost a significant amount of weight, you have sort of excess skin. There's some people who think that extended periods of fasting or aerobic exercise may help redistribute some of that tissue, so you can help get rid of some of that. I think it's possible. I don't really know of the evidence to support it, but again, it might depend on the individual and their sort of like previous status and how they respond to a given stimulus.
Yeah. Based upon stimulus, it's a good thing to bring up here, because I think about people that might be listening or watching, really overweight, have a lot of weight to lose. 30, 60 minutes of aerobic exercise is not necessarily in the cards yet, but or in terms of a specific intensity that we might be talking about. Does the intensity level vary in terms of when that autophagy is going to begin? So someone that is not trained, okay, so let's take me, I'm well conditioned. For me to reach that point of autophagy that we are talking about, do I potentially have to go harder and go longer that we know of?
So all the research that's been done to date, and that's one good thing about sort of the applied exercise literature, is that the effort is always scaled to capacity. So you're always doing work at a given percent of usually either your VO2 max or your watts at VO2 max, say if you're on a bike or something like that. So then I think it's all relative, right? So if you are completely untrained and your VO2 max is somewhere between 20 and 30 mils of oxygen per kilo per minute, right? Then it doesn't take much effort to reach that 50 or 60% where they've seen autophagy being upregulated. I don't think anybody's like really looked across the entire scale. You sort of like pick a level and see what happens there. But I think because it's relative, yes, so you're going to have to push harder, but it's also you're able to push harder because you have greater capacity. So I think it all sort of evens out based on an individual's current conditioning level.
Interesting. Okay, so that makes a lot more sense, because especially if we're talking about VO2 max, then that kind of clears that up. I think where I was getting possibly hung up on it is, okay, if someone is just resistance training, and it might be, their level of adaptation is going to be so much earlier on than say mine. And we probably don't know the answer specifically with resistance training on how that applies, since the research seems to look at more VO2 max. But it's just, I know that's a question that comes up, is people always want to know, okay, how is it more custom tailored for me? When do I get to this autophagy response? And the unfortunate thing that we have to say, it's fortunate for people that like hard work, but a lot of times like these kinds of things come with effort, right? You have to work hard. You have to be able to push it. Is there a line of diminishing return that we're aware of? So like if we start pushing into zone 4, zone 5 and go really heavy intensity in terms of aerobic work or even, or aerobic pushing into that anaerobic threshold and really going above and beyond, does that have less impact, or does it continue? I'm sure there's a line of diminishing return, but is there actually negative impact as far as like start going so high? Is there so much ROS that ends up elevating that you're kind of counteracting the effects of autophagy?
Again, I don't think we know. However, if we think about it as a function of intensity and energy flux, obviously if you go harder, it'll be a shorter period of time, but maybe sort of like the area under the curve of energy demand ends up being similar. So yes, probably up to a point, more intensity is better. But then you'll get to a point where you can't push harder without going for a shorter period of time. So then maybe my guess is it kind of averages out. Again, if we think about, sort of exhaustive resistance training where you're getting this early AMPK response, that's kind of similar to activating AMPK through aerobic exercise. So so it's probably, if you just think about it as like a net flux effect, like how much total energy have you required your cells to use. The only time that I'd maybe be concerned is that we know very high intensity, high volume athletes are at risk sort of longer term from certain things. So particularly like AFib. So like the heart seems to get this like tissue level inflammation from this really high volume of high intensity endurance exercise. And it's been modeled in the lab as well, where you get mice and you basically put them on a weighted treadmill, and it's that kind of like high intensity hard work for long periods of time. It's probably not great for all the tissues in the body, and maybe the heart is the one where we've seen that the most. But equally, I think if people are being sensible in terms of rest and recovery and giving themselves to adapt to the stimulus that's being put on them, it's unlikely you'd probably have other signs of either overtraining or at least sort of that you're pushing harder than you're able to recover from. And then I'm probably less worried about autophagy than I am about a whole bunch of other things, and hormones and all that other kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's for people like you and I, that's on our radar. And one of the concerns that I have is people get very hung up on the word autophagy, and they get very hung up on that with fasting. And yes, it's an awesome thing. Okay, don't get me wrong, but when you start fasting so much, obviously there's a very clear line of diminishing return. In fact, a very stark line of detriment when you start going too far. The same applies for exercise, and definitely the same applies for exercise while also being fasted. And you look at people that are overweight that start thinking, okay, well, these benefits of autophagy are coming because I'm fasting. Yes, they could be, but a lot of times you're losing weight and you're probably more active and you're probably getting more benefit from autophagy, the fact that you're more active because you're losing weight. But they get addicted to that autophagy sort of, I say response. They don't necessarily know what it feels like, but they think they do. They think, okay, I'm fasting, so I'm going through this autophagy. So if I'm having this much autophagic flux right now, then a little bit more is better. And how do I keep pushing it? And there's a fine line where autophagy doesn't really matter. And just like you said, you're much more concerned with other things, right? Like then you start looking at your cortisol, your testosterone, all these things that are plummeting because of this. And who cares if you have all the autophagy in the world if that stuff is going in the toilet, right? I want to kind of hit on buzzwords because I think it's important to talk about things that people are talking about. And I get really concerned because I see things in Instagram and like short reels where people are trying to make statements in 20 seconds, and it's the most frightening thing in the world. And one of the things that's coming up a lot is mitophagy, and it's these words come around a lot, right? Someone talks about them and then they get taken, and so mitophagy obviously is autophagy happening at a mitochondrial level. Do you think aerobic exercise is going to have that same impact as far as mitophagy is concerned? Like, is autophagy sort of the big umbrella and everything is kind of happening underneath that umbrella, or is mitophagy totally separate and apart?
It's so funny that you talk about this because, do you know what, I've done some occasional extended fasts. I do a lot of aerobic exercise because I think about the cardiovascular benefits. It helps me recover faster so I can get more work done in the gym. A load of benefits. I've literally never once thought about my aerobic exercise and my autophagy, because it's just so disconnected from the real world that I literally never thought about it. But we're talking about it because it's interesting and people want to hear about it. And I would kind of fit mitophagy into there. And yes, I think that broadly when autophagy is happening, you're probably getting mitophagy. Unless you are sort of experimentally in animals manipulating specific pathways. And in general, when we've looked at autophagy in humans, so again, it's usually in muscle and usually in response to exercise or fasting, then we look at autophagy in general. So we look at things like UOK1, P62, LC3, which are kind of like all the different proteins involved in different parts of autophagy. But I know of one study at least where they did both. They also looked at the proteins associated with mitophagy. So instead of UOK1 being the master regulator, it's regulated by PINK1 and PARKIN. And when they looked at exercise responses to aerobic exercise, they saw like general autophagy responses, and then they also saw upregulation of mitophagy in a similar manner. So I think that whatever you're doing where they've seen it activates autophagy in general, it's probably activating mitophagy as well. And I would just sort of lump that as like a subset, because that's going to be, when you're undergoing autophagy, you're taking organelles, you're taking, proteins either that aren't required or that have aggregated perhaps, and that includes mitochondria. So I wouldn't think of them as separate things in general.
Yeah. Okay. And that's kind of what I would think as well. And the weird caveat is, okay, there's all this twisted, I don't call it research, but interpretation of research where, okay, mitochondrial biogenesis could be a problem if you have dysfunctional mitochondria. Okay, I'll buy that. That makes sense. So then if aerobic exercise is upregulating or increasing PGC1A and you're having more mitochondrial biogenesis occurring, then could aerobic exercise be detrimental? That's kind of the question that I've seen it come up in comments. I'm like, no, I don't see a lot of situations where aerobic exercise would be detrimental, candidly. And I don't think it works quite like that, to the point where you're going to have this dysfunctional mitochondria that's going to replicate more dysfunctional mitochondria because you're exercising. But it brings up that interesting point of, okay, well, where is that line between like mitochondrial biogenesis and also that mitophagy that's occurring? Because, when you look at some of the longevity research, that is a question that comes to mind, although exercise isn't really the point of it. It's just an interesting thought. I don't think there's even an answer. It's just something that I put out there. Like, maybe we'll never really know the answer to that. But
yeah, I think, in general, biology at the cellular level is way smarter than we are. And it integrates all these things over time in a way that we don't really think about it. So if you do a study, you measure one thing at one time and then you might sort of get into your head that, or you have dysfunctional mitochondria and then you're stimulating mitochondrial biogenesis. Are you making more dysfunctional mitochondria? But in general, I think these things sort of happen and integrate over time. So exercise, so say if we think it assists in the recycling of dysfunctional, if you want to call them that, mitochondria, which it does seem to, and we know that autophagy is upregulated with intensity, so more autophagy with greater intensity. And we also know that in general, within the aerobic sphere, the greater the intensity, the greater the mitochondrial biogenesis in response. So I think both of these things are happening. You're clearing out or repairing mitochondria, and that happens through both fusion and fission, and then you take out the bits you don't want and you sort of bind them together. These aren't individual organelles. It's like this complex network that's continuously morphing and changing and talking to itself and other organelles. So I wouldn't really think of it as in those kinds of static processes. And everything that I understand about exercise from a mitochondrial standpoint would say that it both improves mitochondrial function and then stimulates biogenesis. So you can do both.
Yeah, we're not just stimulating this in a petri dish. This is happening in a human body that's having all kinds of other benefits occurring from.
Yeah.
So with that, I guess kind of the golden question. I mean, jumping back to sort of fasted state and exercise, aside from sort of the effect that you might have as far as perception, how a workout is perceived and how nutrition affects your workouts in your own mind, is there much of a benefit to fasted workouts or fasted cardio at that rate if autophagy is really driven by the exercise either way? Do you see much benefit to fasted cardio outside of, hey, I just like it?
As far as I know, no. No sort of like robust, beneficial physiologic mechanism that I can like point to a nice paper that says this shows why fasted cardio is beneficial. There's some nice theoretical stuff on, like carb cycling approaches, and maybe that drives better, adaptations to different fuel sources. But I also think there's probably some personal preference and expectation built into that as well. I know people who are researching this question. They have a hypothesis that in individuals who say are insulin resistant or are changing their body composition through diet and exercise, you may accelerate those adaptive processes if you do your exercise in a fasted versus a fed state. Those are experiments that are being designed and will happen in the future. So I may be wrong. But as yet, I can't point to a single thing that says, yes, that's why you should do your exercise fasted.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one, right? Because you talk to people, it's almost split down the middle. It's like 50% of people that I talk to say, no, I cannot even train when I have food in my system. And the other 50% say, oh my gosh, if I don't have some carbohydrates in me or have something in me, I totally bonk. What's interesting is I notice with the ketogenic world in that community, they very clearly, almost unanimously say, I need to train fasted. I can't stand training with food in my system. And I think, well, that actually kind of makes sense because you're not loading carbohydrates prior to a workout. If you're eating protein and fat, which is going to definitely, I shouldn't say definitely, but it's probably going to impact your workout. You're going to have a lot of energy going to digestion, and that's a heavy meal that's not really providing you a lot of immediate ergogenic aid. Whereas someone that is a very carb-driven person, it's probably a different ball game for them. So it's kind of interesting how you get these two camps of people that like to train fasted and people that don't like to train fasted. But then if you expand upon their diets, you say, well, now it kind of makes sense. You're this fat-adapted person that's not really eating many carbohydrates. So what would be the point in you eating that food if you're not getting immediate fuel from it? Especially when you're so good at glycogen resynthesis, as you are in a lower carb state. Yeah, it's kind of some of the interesting stuff. I can't remember right offhand. I think it was like a Brazilian Journal of Medicine or something like that. It was pretty interesting, talking about the lactate threshold sort of changing in a fasted state, or lactate clearance changing in a fasted state. That's not necessarily my area of expertise, but I found it pretty interesting. It's kind of talking about how when you're in a fasted state, you clear lactate a little bit faster. And my interpretation of that was, okay, well, that could mean a number of different things, but all it's really telling me is that, okay, you're more efficient at probably going through the Cori cycle and taking that lactate and putting it into different. Does it mean that training fasted is necessarily better? Not necessarily. I mean, I could find reasons for my own personal benefit why that would be good, but I could also poke holes in it the other way. I don't know if are you well versed in the lactate world, or is that really not your?
So my I've mainly looked at lactate from a neuroprotection kind of standpoint, where it is certainly an interesting metabolic precursor and maybe has some benefits after a brain injury. And then also the acute, there seems to be after exercise sort of like an acute improvement in cognitive function that may be driven at least partially by lactate and or ketones, or both. And so I would agree with you. Maybe in the fasted state, you have higher throughput through the Cori cycle, and just you're generating glucose from that lactate, and then that becomes a fuel source, and that would be a beneficial thing. The reason why people can kind of spin it as beneficial is because we have this connotation that lactate is a bad thing, when of course it isn't. It's actually very beneficial during exercise for multiple reasons. Except you may get to a point, like when you're absolutely swimming in lactate, there may be this negative effect of very high lactate levels on cognitive function, but very few people, I think, really get to the levels of lactate required to do that on a regular basis. And so, when you're doing anaerobic exercise, yes, lactate increases in the blood, but it's not the lactate that's the problem. There's a whole, there's changes in ion handling. You are accumulating protons, so you are accumulating acid, but it's not the lactate that's driving that. Actually, the lactate buffers some of that, at least when it's first generated. So I think that people might say, oh yeah, better lactate clearance is better during fasting, but actually that's not something that I would necessarily hang my hat on. I can see why it's happening, but I'm not sure that's better or worse one way or the other.
Yeah, that's, more efficient throughput through the Cori cycle doesn't necessarily mean you're going to perform better.
Yeah.
I think the situations that might come interesting, because people ask these questions. Okay, with this kind of 180s that people are doing on different ways of looking at nutrition, then what are applications for this? And I keep coming back to, okay, situations, ultralight backpacking, something like that, where you're going for, that's where I can maybe see, okay, yeah, if you have the ability to have greater throughput with that, then that could make sense when you're going for long periods of time and you need to literally have minimal food. But that's not a typical athlete scenario. Like a typical athlete scenario, you're going to have whatever fuel available you really want to have, or special operations kind of stuff. Like, okay, maybe you're really limited fuel. That's where this kind of stuff gets a little more interesting. But there's about a fraction of a percent of people that really care about that. And so it's really difficult to talk about. in the essence of time, I want to be able to kind of move on because we're going to film some other pieces. So there'll definitely be part 2s and part 3s and probably 10 out of this. But when we start looking at fasting, I don't want people to get the wind taken out of their sail and say, hey, there's no point in fasting if I'm getting more autophagy from exercise and whatnot. First of all, a lot of other benefits we know of with fasting. And one of the things, you are obviously well-versed in everything brain. That's not my wheelhouse. I'm decent at it just from a periphery. But when we look at like early time restricted feeding and things like that, there's still pretty solid concrete benefits as far as like, BMAL and everything like that, circadian clock genes, right? I mean, do you know much in that world?
Yeah. So I think in general, there's a body of literature that says that overall long-term health improves if you have aligned circadian clocks, like central and peripheral. And the timing of food is obviously an important Zeitgeber for the peripheral clocks in particular. And probably the vast majority of evidence comes from mice. It's difficult to interpret because mice are nocturnal, so you have to be really careful about how you sort of translate that to humans. But we also know that in general, individuals who work night shifts or swing shifts, or they have some kind of circadian misalignment, they are at greater risk of insulin resistance and certain cancers and things like that. So I think we can kind of put together this picture that yes, circadian rhythms are important for long-term health, and that would include the alignment of light cues and nutrient cues. So there are multiple ways to skin this cat, and you can make it very complex. However, I think that if you just eat while it's during the daytime and not during the nighttime, that probably covers it for most people. And there's certainly a number of benefits from not always having nutrients being processed in the system. And what I mean by that is in Western society, if we're awake, we're eating, and we're usually in a caloric surplus. That is the average individual at any given time is in a caloric surplus. If you're eucaloric or in a deficit, I think different things come into play. But for the average person, having your body be processing nutrients essentially around the clock, so there's no opportunity for rest and recovery and repair, or at least not in a way that we would normally expect it to. I think that's what's associated with certain detrimental health outcomes. So it's probably there's always going to be caveats, but I think having some sort of regulation on the timing of the food that you eat, particularly in the hypercaloric state, which again, most people gain weight over their lifetime continuously, so they're continuously in some kind of caloric surplus. I think that's probably when it's most problematic, but again, that's what's relevant to the majority of the population.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because every single time, I think I read something a while back, it was like the average American consumes something like over 40 times per day. It's like you just can't stop consuming, and deficit or not, I don't know if that's the best thing to be doing round the clock, right? I mean, and there's a lot of theories you could pull out of this. Okay, well then could I eat round the clock if I was putting myself in a deficit immediately after by intense exercise? And I've seen these questions come up, and it just seems like, okay, now you're trying to manipulate in this such a complicated way where it's really pretty simple. And this is an interesting question, and it wasn't even intended to come up in this conversation. But the aspect of a deficit is so intriguing because it's so simple, but it's also so complex. And you look at like the Okinawans, okay, they'll say, okay, on average, 10 to 15% caloric deficit. Okay, well, does that mean that they're continually reducing calories forever and ever? No. Like, how does someone remain in a deficit? Well, and this is somewhat rhetorical, but I mean, how does someone remain in a deficit while not having to continually reduce calories, while also still balancing muscle protein synthesis to maintain muscle as a glucose sink for good metabolic health as we age?
Yeah, there's an interesting question. I think almost all of so I'm not a big believer in chronic caloric restriction for humans and being some like magic thing for longevity. If you look at, again, we have to go back to the rodent literature, but if you look at a whole bunch of different strains of rats and mice and you calorically restrict them, like a third benefit, a third see no difference, and a third die sooner. And the smart people that I've heard from in the longevity sphere say humans are probably the same. And so there's probably some genetic and other environmental backgrounds that are important. So when I'm talking about eliciting a deficit, this is in the scenario where somebody has adipose tissue above the level that they want, and which they have accumulated over time due to some kind of prolonged caloric excess. I think if you are somebody who is, lean, or at least the body composition that they're happy with and want to maintain long term, I don't think you then need to focus on any kind of deficit beyond that. So almost all the benefits we've seen from humans in terms of caloric deficits are in those who are obese or have types of diabetes or some other metabolic disease, which is usually associated with chronic caloric excess before then. So that's when I think the deficit is important. Once you've then achieved those body composition changes, I think there's as much risk as there is potential benefit from extending a deficit beyond that. And you're right. Over time, you'll have to work harder and harder to make that deficit because the body adapts. You get smaller, right? So your caloric needs diminish as well. And at some point, that is gonna balance out.
Yeah, and I mean, it's never easy to sell insurance, so to speak. But I mean, I like a lot of the answer is, while you are able to build muscle while your hormones are in place, and while you have that, do it, right? But it's so difficult to sell that to somebody, be like, hey, this is going to be good for you 50 years down the line. That's kind of what I've come down to is like, okay, I'm not going to sit here and attempt to be in a deficit all the time. I'm going to naturally sort of let it happen when it happens. But I also understand that, if I eat a Tic Tac right now, I'm immediately in that moment not going to be in a deficit, but I might be in a deficit 10 minutes later, right? There's always a balance. And it's not just about, okay, I have 100% being a deficit all the time. It's about kind of finding those places where you can sort of enlist a deficit, even if it's through exercise, right?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in these things integrating over long periods of time, right? I mean, your sort of body composition and body weight integrates over months or years. It doesn't happen on a daily basis. Although daily energy availability can be important for menstruating females based on it can be important for their cycle. But sort of in general, this stuff integrates over long periods of time. So now I can't remember the point that I was going to make. I'm sure it was very important and very interesting. But yeah. I went into a caveat and then I forgot what I was going to say.
I think the point is ultimately across though, and it's just that these integrating these things over time, right? So it's a deficit is not absolute. It's just because I am in let's hypothetically say a 5% deficit right now. It doesn't mean I'm going to be in a 5%. If I go sit down and eat, I'm not going to be in a deficit at that point in time. So like, what is this cumulative effect? And I always try to say like, okay, if it's is it a dimmer switch or is it an on-off switch as far as a deficit is concerned? Like if I am 0.025% in a deficit, is the switch flipped and is it accelerated more if I'm in more of a deficit, or is the benefit just ever so slightly being in a deficit over the aggregate of say a 30-day period of time, right? And that's kind of how I look at it. I'm like, okay, well, as I age, my basal metabolic rate is probably going to slow down anyway. And okay, maybe I'll just aim to be in that ever so slight deficit when I look at my calories for the course of a year, right? And I'm not counting my calories for a year, so good luck.
Yeah, and I think, again, having the long view is the important thing. And now I remember what I was going to say, which is that having worked with a number of people who've either tried to or struggled to or achieved long-term body composition changes. And I always talk about body composition because like your weight on a scale means literally nothing to me. I couldn't care less. I don't think it tells you anything at all, basically. And because, muscle mass, like what is that weight made up of, how, all that kind of stuff. So people who I think have successfully, so if you need to successfully maintain a deficit for a long period of time, obviously having the long view is important because I think the majority of these benefits integrate over time. All you're trying to do is improve body composition and relative muscle mass and adiposity, because that's what seems to be the major driver of long-term metabolic health, in addition to a bunch of other environmental factors. But if you put your body in an environment that supports normal appetite regulation, a lot of this kind of happens by itself, and you don't need to micromanage it. And what I mean by that is if you get adequate sleep, and you eat food that isn't hyper dense calorically and sort of nutrient deficient, because there's some nice data on very calorically dense foods sort of overriding certain satiety mechanisms. And then there's another recent paper that came out that shows that food texture has an effect as well. So if you're eating very soft, calorically dense foods, those are the ones you're likely to overeat. But if you're eating crunchy, less calorically dense foods, you'll eat less of those sort of overall, but still feel similarly satiated. So like the food quality matters. So I think having some nutrients in there, not being too calorically dense, having slept properly, having done some exercise, maybe not being stressed about everything all the time. Like if you put the body in that environment, I think that some of this stuff starts to self-regulate, and then you don't need to sort of micromanage it. Of course, if you want more accelerated changes and or your body composition matters for your performance or your sort of professional livelihood, right? If you're a professional bodybuilder, right, you can't just like think if I sleep enough, I'll get down to 3% body fat. Of course, it doesn't work that way. But for the average individual, sort of creating that supportive environment does help regulate appetite, and then you will better regulate satiety signals, both coming from the gut, coming from systemic energy stores, and this stuff will start to sort of take care of itself over time for most people.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it's just a matter of, especially once you get yourself out of sort of that metabolic like trauma center, that triage, right? And you're kind of trying to, like, once you break yourself out of that and systems are starting to operate more normal, then it just makes sense. Then you just come right back down to, okay, what can I surround myself with to give myself the right lifestyle that supports sleep, supports a lower stress life and whatnot. So with that, we'll wrap this one up, man. But where can people find you?
Probably easiest to find me on Instagram, at Dr. Tommy Wood. It's mainly posts of my dogs in the gym, but occasionally I'll post a paper or some snarky comment about diet and nutrition in the popular media or on social media. So if you enjoy anything like that, then that's probably the best place to find me.
Yeah, I saw something recently that they said that milk is now better than water for hydration. Did you see that one?
Oh, well, I mean, a couple of years ago it was beer, so that was better than water for hydration. So pick your poison.
Anyway, man. So as always, keep it locked here on the channel. And Dr. Wood, thank you so much, man.
Thanks.